They could explain what happened at Drogheda. Enemy soldiers descend on a town, they round up the population, the men and women are separated, the men are put against a wall and shot. Unfortunately, a very common tactic in theatres of war. Would that be gendercide? Yeah? Yes, that would fit much more within the definition of gendercide, because even though the tactic is usually used to decrease the potential pool of soldiers, they are not soldiers, they are not combatants, and they can't fight back. Right. Look at where I was. Now, generally speaking, very few people tend to fail to notice a massacre of that sort of scale. But gendercide in the world today, outside the flashpoints of warfare, is much less obvious, but it occurs on a massive scale, and the victims of this invisible gendercide are almost exclusively female. In their book, Half the Sky, which refers to an expression that says, women hold up half the sky, Nicholas Kristof and his wife Cheryl Woodun write, more girls have been killed in the last 50 years, precisely because they are girls, than men were killed in all the wars of the 20th century combined. More girls are killed in this routine gendercide in any one decade than people were slaughtered in all the genocides of the 20th century. Now, that is quite a claim if we consider that the 20th century may have been one of the bloodiest in human history. But I would suggest to you today that that is not an exaggeration, and it's not before time that the issue of gendercide is finally starting to be taken seriously. For the sake of clarity, from this point on, if I refer to gendercide, I will be referring to the killing of females. Now, for years, and I'm sorry this picture didn't come out better, sex-selective abortion has been the ginormous, noisy elephant in the room when it comes to feminist circles, with considerable levels of reluctance to discuss the subject at all. But sex-selective abortion is widespread in many parts of the world, including China and India. I will talk quite a lot about those countries, but increasingly in many other countries, and among communities living in Europe, Canada, and the United States. There are an estimated 60 million missing baby girls in Asia alone. For missing, read dead. We're not going to find them. With hundreds of thousands of baby girls aborted every year. The global figure is an estimated 160 million. That's the numbers that are missing, sort of they're currently missing. A paper published in The Lancet 10 years ago estimated that some 10 million baby girls are aborted in India sort of over a period of 2 decades. But that was 10 years ago, of course, and today numbers are thought to be even higher, with the Invisible Girl Project, which I'll refer to later, claiming more baby girls are aborted in India and China every year than the total number of girls who were born in the United States, with a baby girl aborted in India at a rate of 1 a minute. Nor is gender imbalance entirely a rural problem either. There's always an assumption that these problems only ever sort of occur in isolated areas where maybe there's a high dependence on agriculture. But there is evidence to suggest that sex-selective abortion may be even more of a problem among affluent city dwellers who want the social cachet of a son and can pay for what they want, or what they don't want. Now, just to keep in mind, a healthy sex ratio should be about equal, should be about 1 to 1, but slightly more male babies tend to be born naturally. So you can have natural fluctuations of up to about 106 to 107 boys to 100 girls. Bear in mind, women also tend to have a higher life expectancy, are much less likely to die of natural causes in infancy, and are less likely to be killed in accidents. Women have never been the weaker or the more foolish sex, in any sense of the word. So allowing for small variations, the numbers should be about equal. India's sex ratio is skewed across the population, but according to the 2011 census, the gender imbalance in the 0 to 6 age group, so the youngest age group, is at its worst since independence. However, some provinces or territories do buck the trend, one of them being Kerala, which has the lowest excess female mortality rate in India. That doesn't mean there is no gendercide in Kerala relative to other countries, but it is the lowest in India. Now, I can't prove a causal link here. I'm just drawing your attention to the fact that coincidentally, women in Kerala have the highest literacy rates in the country, and property can be inherited through the female line, through the maternal line. And if you think about it, if you've worked all your life to save and acquire land, you have to have someone to pass it on to. Inheritance is a very important factor. But besides Kerala, the majority of provinces do show a significant and dangerous gender imbalance, which is having significant consequences for women who are fortunate enough to be born. These are just a few. They include an increase in sexual violence and exploitation of women through rape, wife sharing, baby smuggling, and trafficking. Dr. B.S. Dahiya, a former senior government official, gave this stark warning over a decade ago. Violence against women is rising. We'll have more unnatural practices, such as brothers sharing a wife. In a few years, no woman will be safe. There will be abductions and rapes, even of minors. This warning was echoed much more recently by the Council of Europe, commenting on the increasingly skewed sex ratios in countries such as Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. According to the Council of Europe, sex-selective abortion is likely to create difficulties for men to find spouses, lead to serious human rights violations such as forced prostitution, trafficking for the purpose of marriage or exploitation, and contribute to a rise in criminality and social unrest. In China, they talk about the phenomenon of bare branches or bare sticks, that is, young men who cannot find a wife, cannot settle down and establish a family. There are now some 40 million men in China, the majority in rural areas, who will never find a wife, who will never establish a family of their own. I don't want to indulge in any sort of inverse misogyny, but it's not in the interest of society to have large numbers of footloose men charging about. It's not actually very good for the health of society. And within China, some of the consequences, even that I've listed here, include the re-emergence of undesirable marriage practices, including child brides, marriage purchase, and so-called levirate marriage. That's when the man dies, his brother and widow are obliged to marry. This is not to mention the increase in extramarital affairs, trafficking, use of prostitutes, and the spread of sexually transmitted disease in China, particularly in areas with large numbers of bare branches. The tragedy is that the dangers of a significant gender imbalance was warned about a generation ago. And if those early warning signs had been heeded, it's a big if. But perhaps the situation need not have become so serious. Amartya Sen, the economist and Nobel laureate, warned 25 years ago about the tens of millions of missing women in the world, said that gender-based abortions are part of a new sex discrimination. I quote, sex-selective abortion of female fetuses, what can be called natality discrimination, is a kind of high-tech manifestation of preference for boys. The next question. Why should it happen at all? We can talk about what it is, we can talk about how it happens, but the biggest question, the first question, is surely why? Now, it would probably take a lecture series to begin to answer that, because the reasons for son preference are very complex and run through many cultures around the world. It's partly simply a manifestation of an ingrained misogyny that has always seen women as a liability, the weaker sex, the lesser man. And I think probably There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of PhDs and political tracts written about that particular problem and trying to unpack the reasons why women have not had full equality in society. Gendercide is simply the brutal conclusion to the belief that girls' lives are worthless. But within countries and communities where son preference is still a major issue, there can be more specific cultural and even economic considerations. You'll probably have heard a great deal about India's dowry system, which can make having a daughter cripplingly expensive for a family. Now, the dowry system was legally prohibited in 1961, but it continues unabated. But bear in mind, the dowry system existed for hundreds of years in many countries, including this one, and including most of Europe. I mean, I remember reaching an age, I think there's at least one other Maltese in the room, who might back me up on this, when I think it was in my early teens, when my mother suddenly started buying me, like for birthdays and Christmas, little bits of jewellery, little bangles and things, little things to put around my neck. And it was only much later I realised, on a completely subconscious level, she was giving me a dowry. Because traditionally, the woman wore the dowry on her person. And even though girls from my culture hadn't had a dowry for decades, there was still this little sense that a girl needed a little bit of help to make her way in the world, or at least a man needed a bit of a bribe to get a daughter off the parents' hands. A not unrelated issue, in fact, is the patrilocal tradition, which is very common in cultures where gendercide occurs. This is the tradition where the woman goes to live with the husband's parents, not the other way around. Therefore, the woman cares for the husband's parents in their old age, rather than her own. And in societies without a welfare state, the elderly are completely dependent upon their children to support them. So if a daughter's going to go off and support somebody else, that is going to be a problem. That's why you get sayings such as, daughters are raised to water other men's gardens. But other issues, and the list is endless, can also come into play. Inheritance through the male line, the need in rural communities for boys to help out on farms, religious sensibilities, the belief that a man needs his son to light his funeral pyre to see him safely to the next world. Or even just that belief, no matter how little admitted, that a boy is a blessing and a girl a curse. For this reason, the tendency to create these small disparities in sex ratios has always existed, but with the arrival of ultrasound and much more widely practiced abortion, the problem has massively escalated. There's no getting round the fact that abortion is a major factor in the demographic crisis we're facing. However, whereas some groups are beginning to speak openly about the dangers of sex-selective abortion, there tends to be this awkwardness and evasiveness about talking about abortion itself. And instead, a great deal is said about the need to change cultural prejudices. We're not really grasping the nettle. I'm trying to work out why I said there was a slide change there. Okay, that's why. At the same time, I think partly because the abortion debate is so polarised and so aggressive, there's this dogmatic determination that you have got to defend abortion at all costs, under all circumstances, even if it means defending the elimination of baby girls, even if it means tacitly supporting the bullying of women into sex-selective abortions by patriarchal forces. I remember reading an article in The Guardian by a journalist who put forward this argument. Please listen, because this argument was trotted out a lot during the recent debate. What about when a pregnant woman lives in a society that gives her real and considerable reason to fear having a girl? The kind of society where dowry systems mean an inconveniently gendered child could bankrupt a family, or one where a livid patriarch deprived of a male heir could turn his fury on both mother and daughter. In those situations, a woman wouldn't just be justified in seeking sex-selective abortion, she'd be thoroughly rational to do so. Just have a little think about that one. Now, it seems to me as a pro-life feminist that's a little incongruous for a self-proclaimed feminist to argue that sacrificing the lives of baby girls in the name of appeasing violent misogyny, and thereby perpetuating it indefinitely, is ever an acceptable approach. It's certainly not regarded as acceptable by those working on the ground. Some feminists in developing countries get very angry by just this sort of argument, this constant determination to keep finding excuses. Now, cultural context will always provide reasons, but they should not be excuses. As one campaigner for an anti-gendercide group in India warned, in 20 years, 1/5 of the women in India will have been systematically exterminated. This is the genocidal targeting of a group by a society in whichever way it can. So it's odd to talk about changing mindsets as the method of stopping this mass extermination of women when we wouldn't do that for the mass extermination of any other group. Think about it. We wouldn't say, oh look, this minority group are being ethnically cleansed from the face of the earth by these thugs who really hate them, so we should try to understand the cultural context. Maybe through outreach and education, we can change the climate in which these attacks occur. And if there's anybody left, then maybe things will be better in a generation or two. The answer is surely this has got to stop. The innocent must be protected. We know that women can be and are threatened with divorce and violence if they refuse to abort an unwanted baby girl. During a recent attempt in this country to ban sex-selective abortions, groups such as GINA International and other women's networks spoke of their work with women who have suffered abuse as a result of being pregnant with a baby girl. The director of GINA International told the newspaper Eastern Eye, "Women are aborting for many diverse reasons, from ensuring equity in their family and community, domestic violence, and being culturally enslaved to believe that their status, marriage, value will be elevated." These are some of the groups that you may see that are campaigning against this. No humanitarian organisation that really cares about women is going to argue that supporting a practice that is in itself discriminatory marks a positive step for women. The emphasis is on stopping the practice and protecting women at risk of abuse. As Saida Mughal of one women's group put it, "Our experience tells us practical help is needed in communities where women are sometimes devalued and degraded to the extent that people try to stop a female from being born." However, I asked you to pay attention to that Guardian article because that argument that somehow performing a sex-selective abortion on a woman who doesn't even want it is humane because it prevents her from being beaten into a miscarriage was used quite seriously by some lobby groups to campaign against the recent amendment to the Serious Crime Bill that would have prevented sex-selective abortion. As journalist Tim Stanley pointed out, when the amendment was being much discussed in the press, this argument implies the state ought to ignore or even assist those men who pressure their partners to have abortions. It would make much more sense for society to oppose sex-selective abortion and the chauvinism that makes it happen, rather than lamely accepting that some men will always hate women. I was trying to think of an analogy to this whole idea. I suddenly thought, well, what if a feminist were to tell a woman, "We know your husband always beats you if you don't have the dinner on the table at 7:30 every evening. And because we want to empower you, we're going to use all our resources to help you get that dinner on the table for 7:30 every evening because we really want you to enjoy equality in society." Do you feel empowered, ladies? No. And that's only the dinner. That's not anything nearly as serious as what goes on in those clinics. You know. But where things do get very complicated, though, and this really makes it difficult for the medical profession, is where you get the preference for a boy over a girl manifesting itself very subtly, such as influencing the care that a mother receives during pregnancy. And this is really quite difficult to spot. Some groups, such as Martyr Care International, I don't know how many of you have heard of Martyr Care, it's a group of obstetricians and gynecologists who campaign for maternity care in developing countries. They talk about domestic violence happening both by commission and by omission. So by an actual action or by the deliberate refusal to come to a woman's assistance. So for example, a doctor standing back and watching a woman bleeding to death in labour and not coming to her assistance, say. But let's consider this situation. This is actually taken from the blog of an obstetrician in India writing about his experiences in a maternity hospital. A woman's brought into hospital. She's in labour. Labour's going well. And the family are absolutely insistent she has to have a caesarean. Now this rings a few alarm bells because caesarean is really expensive and there's no reason for it. But they insist and they insist, and so eventually they perform the caesarean and deliver a boy. And it is always a boy. The reverse scenario will also happen. A woman will come in, she's in a terrible state, in great danger, and the family will obstruct and obstruct and obstruct. And eventually the woman will give birth to a dying or dead baby girl. And in those situations, the doctor will be fairly sure that the family knew perfectly well the woman was carrying a boy or a girl, but they can't prove anything. In fact, this doctor talked about one situation which was particularly upsetting in a way, where a woman was brought in this situation. The family would not accept her being transferred to a better hospital, and the doctor was sure that she was carrying a girl. It just was gut feeling. I've seen this one before. A few days later, he's doing the ward round, and someone says to him, "You know that woman who was brought in? Good news, she delivered a healthy baby boy." And he thought, okay, I made an assumption I shouldn't have made. And he went to see her, and the father greeted him with a great big smile on his face and said, "Oh, doctor, thank you, we're so happy. We thought it was a girl." So he had in fact been right. The country currently that has the worst gender imbalance in the world is China, probably no surprises there. I'm told that there is an old Chinese proverb that it's better to have one crippled son than 8 healthy daughters. I don't even know where to start on a comment like that, really. The cultural son preference has been hugely exacerbated by the country's brutal birth control policy, which has been described as the greatest bioethical atrocity on the globe and an egregious attack on women. China's birth control policies have been and continue to be responsible for many terrible atrocities against women, but there is a direct correlation between this enforced birth limitation in China and the skewed sex ratio. According to the US Congressional Executive Commission on China, the average male to female sex ratio for infant to 4-year-old age group in China is 123.26 males to every 100 females. Bear in mind, the highest it should be is 107. While the 2 provinces with the highest gender imbalance, it's a particularly bad story. 140 to 100 is a huge gender imbalance. And just to give you a bit more of an idea of how things are nationally. Where it gets interesting, though, it's always very bad when the youngest age group has the biggest problems. It shows the problem's getting worse, not better. Where things do get interesting, though, is that there are only 2 provinces in China which have normal sex ratios. Tibet you will have heard of. China's birth limitation policies have some exceptions, including if you are an ethnic minority Chinese. And these 2 provinces have majority ethnic minorities. So the majority of people in those provinces are not bound by the birth control laws. The world's attention was drawn to the consequences of China's disappearing girls with the trial of a doctor in January 2014. 55-year-old obstetrician Dr. Zheng was sentenced to death for child trafficking. She told parents their baby had died or was dying or was suffering from some severe disability and should be placed for adoption. The babies were then sold to traffickers, with baby boys fetching nearly twice the sum of baby girls. She's thought to have sold scores of babies over the last 8 years, and at least one was found dead in a ditch, having been dumped by traffickers. So this is a person who has caused untold heartache to parents, deprived children of their fundamental human rights, and at least one case, her actions have resulted in death. I in no way wish to justify anything this doctor has done. I will, however, say that her actions are no more heinous than those carried out by thousands of family planning officials with state approval, and that these crimes were made possible because of the moral and socio-economic framework created by the one-child policy. The one-child policy has turned male babies into highly prized commodities. You may incidentally have heard media reports that China is relaxing or even abandoning the one-child policy. This is not actually correct. It's largely hype. There have always been couples who are entitled to more than one baby. They've just extended the categories. In the end, in essence, the policy has not changed. The state still takes it upon itself to decide when a couple may or may not have a child. So it's still coercive, and in demographic terms, it will change very little. Before we move on, can anyone see anything odd about this picture? Yeah. Notice straight away. That little bangle he's wearing is in fact a handcuff. This is Beijing International Airport. It was around the time of Chinese New Year. The father said he had heard a lot of warnings on the television about child snatchers. And he was so worried about something happening to his daughter that he chained her to his person. That is the level of paranoia that you can sometimes get when trafficking becomes a problem. And that picture at the time went viral. I should say, by way of balance, I have come across cases of female infanticide related to the birth limitation policy as well, though abortion is usually the culprit. In his book, A Mother's Ordeal, I would really seriously suggest that you read A Mother's Ordeal if you've never really come across the situation in China. Steve Mosher retells the story of a family in rural China years ago who had a beautiful, doe-eyed 5-year-old daughter. The mother then became pregnant with an illegal second child. She knew she would not get permission to give birth to this baby. And she'd either found out or simply decided that the baby was a boy. So she started to resent the presence of the girl for blocking the birth of the boy. So one night, the parents took the child to some deserted woodland where they had dug a grave to bury her alive. She managed to get out of the grave and made a run for it, but the father hit her over the head with a shovel, killing her instantly. They then buried her and went back home. But several days later, the villagers became a little bit suspicious. They hadn't seen the child out playing. It's a small village. People will notice. And the couple eventually confessed to the murder. Both the man and his pregnant wife were immediately executed. Now, that may seem like a tragic exception, but that murder, like sex-selective abortion, represents the bloody extreme of a patriarchal system in which girls' lives are expendable. Because when an unwanted baby girl is fortunate enough to survive gestation, studies show a girl's life may still be at risk. In India, infant mortality is 75% higher among girls compared with boys, because of infanticide, but also because of abuse and neglect of girls. Some 20% of India's missing girls in the under 20 age group were born. The majority perish before birth, but some, a significant proportion, die sometime between childhood and adolescence. Thank you. We shouldn't fall into the trap either of assuming that atrocities like this only happen in other countries. Tragically, gendercide occurs in this country under our very noses. I don't know how many of you remember that sting operation a few years ago. Journalists filmed doctors who were happy to perform sex-selective abortions. I mean, one of them even said, well, that's not fair, is it? It's a kind of female infanticide. Let me sign the form so you can go and get rid of her. And they got the mildest possible slap on the wrist for doing this. But a lot of people were genuinely disgusted by that footage, including people who usually are in favour of abortion. And during a parliamentary debate, Emily Thornberry, who's not my favourite person, who's very, very pro-abortion, was quick to express her objections. She stated, "Gender-based abortion is part of a complex of misogynistic beliefs and practices to which we cannot give an inch. Along with female infanticide, it is the purest expression of the belief that the male is more valuable than the female. For invariably, gender-based abortions involve the destruction of female fetuses. We do not hear of males being aborted. Women are not the weaker sex. We are not a curse. We are not a burden to be disposed of as a family sees fit. What is more, people have to be completely myopic not to see that if it becomes known doctors are taking a no-questions-asked attitude to gender-selective abortion, women will be pressurised into having them. Gender-selective abortions are at root an exercise of patriarchal and communal coercion, not female choice. But the reaction from the biggest proponents of abortion have been to support sex-selective abortion as just another choice. Or to argue, as Anne Furedi did, I can always rely on Anne Furedi to say something like this, she's the director of the abortion provider BPAS. No one, in fact, requests abortions on grounds of gender unless they're an undercover journalist. When the former medical director of her own organisation, Dr. Michael Argent, has said covert sex-selective abortion was widespread and occurred in all communities. This was corroborated by the independent newspaper who conducted their own investigation and uncovered clear evidence that sex-selective abortion was occurring in some communities in Britain. The government at the time tried to whitewash the whole issue. No, there's no evidence at all of sex-selective abortion. But the Independent found that around 1 in 10 girls were missing among certain ethnic groups in the country. What the Independent did, which led them to that conclusion, which was independently verified by statisticians, was they didn't just look at the raw figures for births, but at the gender of second children if the first was a girl. Now, this is actually quite important because if there is a son preference, a couple are more likely to welcome a girl if she comes first, because there's a chance they could have another go. I was born in Italy. I'm not actually Italian, but my mother still talks about how when I was born, she was lying in the hospital with me in a pink blanket or something, and the woman next to her had had a baby boy. And the nonna came to see her little grandson and looked at me in the cot and said, "Oh, a girl. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Well, you know, it's not all bad news. She won't have to go and fight in a war. Yeah. And you're young, you can try again. Better luck next time." My parents didn't have better luck, they had another girl. So my father never got a son. But, you know, there is always that feeling if the first child is a girl, a couple can console themselves they might have better luck next time. Maybe next time they have a boy. So when things get a little suspicious is when a disproportionately large number of second children are boys when the first is a girl. That is what the Independent found when they analysed the statistics, and the sex ratio became progressively more and more skewed the further down the line the child came, as the couple became more and more desperate to have a boy. This was also found to be true in Canadian and American studies. In some cases, the disparity is very, very significant. According to the UN Population Fund, which I don't like at all, in Armenia, the sex ratio for first and second child is more or less normal. The sex ratio for a third child is 175 boys to 100 girls. That is huge. That cannot be natural. An even big gender disparity is found in China in cases where a second child is permitted, along with a larger than average age gap between children when the first is a girl and the second a boy. Now, this is not conclusive, but there's always a bit of a suspicion when you have an above average age gap that maybe there was an abortion in the middle. You know, that perhaps the second one was a girl, and so they had an abortion and then tried for a boy. It's not conclusive, it's just a little bit suspect. But I think in terms of really wrapping up this, we shouldn't forget, when we're exploring this most distressing of issues, the effect it must have on the mothers themselves. When it comes to gendercide, women are the victims on every possible level. from the unborn baby girls who perish to the infant girls who are neglected to death, to the grown women and girls who suffer the indirect consequences of gendercide. But let us not forget the women who are pressured into having the abortions, women who lose their bodily integrity, who lose their daughters, and who lose their motherhood. I have read passionate assurances by the senior staff of abortion facilities that women are never left in the position in this country where they're forced to undergo an abortion they don't want. I'm looking at the back at the abortion counsellors, to see if good counsel have never come across a woman who was pressured into an abortion. They are identified and they are empowered to make the choice they really want to make, without any indication being given of how this actually happens in practice. The fantasy world of every abortion, a wanted an abortion, is very wide of the mark at the best of times. When it comes to sex-selective abortion, it is particularly far from reality. I'm speaking of women like Samira, not her real name, who agreed to speak to journalists about her ordeal at a time when the great and the good were claiming sex-selective abortion wasn't happening. She says, and I'm going to quote her as extensively as possible. I think her voice has a right to be heard. On the day of the termination, I went into the clinic crying. I was crying and could not stop. The nurse saw I was upset, but she just said, "Just put these tablets inside you." They weren't concerned that this person looked upset. I was crying, but I was trying to be careful, because what if they didn't go ahead with the abortion and then my husband would blame me? I just wanted them to stop. I just wanted to run away from there. But the thing was, where would I run away to? What would I do? The last day before I had the abortion, I said to him very clearly that what he was doing was wrong. I felt I couldn't make the choice on my own, because if I'd made that choice and gone ahead with the baby, he would actually end the pregnancy himself. He beat me up to such a state, there would be no pregnancy inside me. I was scared of that. The worst thing was, when I went in, I had a bump. And when I came out, there was no bump. I kept touching it, and I just wanted to scream, but the noise wouldn't come out. I wanted my baby back. What service did that abortion facility do that woman? Are there any pro-life feminists in the audience who would stand with such a woman? It horrifies me that in the 21st century, in this country, there are women who are going weeping into abortion facilities, losing babies they loved, and asking that question, where would I run to? The self-proclaimed feminist apparently prefers to do violent men's dirty work for them. They prefer to prevent the most vulnerable of human females from being granted the privilege of birth. It is for pro-life feminists, therefore, to stand with women like Samira and her unborn baby daughters, to provide a place for them where they can seek refuge, and to ensure that this most brutal form of misogyny ends once and for all. Thank you.